And that led to their defeat by King Nebuchadnezzar. And I expect a lot of you know who he is, but he was quite an evil king. And he showed no mercy, destroying Jerusalem, burning Solomon's temple, and taking its treasures. And those who, you could say, were lucky enough to survive were exiled to Babylon, where they remained captive until Nebuchadnezzar's death. And Babylon later fell to Persia, which is modern-day Iran. And under Persian rule, the exiled Jews were allowed to return home. They started to be allowed to return home, and they had some favour with King Cyrus of Persia. And he issued a decree allowing 50,000 of the Jews to return under a man called Zerubbabel's leadership. And the people had gained relative freedom under Babylon and Persian rule after Nebuchadnezzar's death. And they were allowed to own homes and land and take jobs. And some of them ended up working in government, really. And we hear of people that you will probably recognise, like Daniel and Mordecai and Esther, rising to prominent positions. And King Cyrus encouraged their return to Jerusalem, probably hoping to secure some loyalty and actually a sort of buffer to his empire. And we hear of the first act of rebuilding was actually to rebuild the temple. They started to rebuild the temple, but before they did that, they started to rebuild the altar. And that was the first wave of the Jews going back to Jerusalem. Under the second return, you'll hear about Ezra. And that was about 80 years later under King Artaxerxes. And Ezra led about 2,000 men and their families back to Jerusalem. And though the temple had stood for about 58 years, the people had fallen into spiritual decline. They'd intermarried with the foreigners that had been also exiled because there were so many wars and so many different factions living there. And they started to oppose God's ways. And Artaxerxes provided gold and silver and treasures to restore the temple. And Ezra was sent to re-establish God's laws and confront the spiritual disobedience and lead the people to repentance. And worship was revived. And Ezra and Nehemiah and Esther, they're all contemporaries. So although you read the separate books and it makes it seem like it's, different time periods, they're all actually within the same time period. So following years of opposition, we now join the story with Nehemiah in about 445 BC. Could I have the first slide? So the words of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah. In the month of Kislev, in the 20th year, while I was in the citadel of Susa, Hanani, one of my brothers, came from Judah with some other men. And I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that had survived the exile and also about Jerusalem. They said to me, those who survived the exile are back in the province and are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down and its gates have burned with fire. Nehemiah says, when I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. And then I said, Lord, the God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and keep his commandments, let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer of your servant, the prayer that your servant is praying before you day and night for your servants, the people of Israel. I confess the sins we Israelites, including myself and my father's family, have committed against you. We have acted very wickedly towards you. We have not obeyed the commands, decrees, and laws you gave your servant Moses. Remember the instruction you gave your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and obey my commands, then even if your exiled people are at the farthest horizon, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place I have chosen as a dwelling for my name. I need some water. They are your servants and your people, whom you redeemed by your great strength and your mighty hand. Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of this your servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. Give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man. I was cupbearer to the king. So chapter 1 recounts the story of a visit to Nehemiah by his brother and others. And we don't know if it's actually his brother. The term might have just meant a blood relative or simply referring to a fellow Jew. But Jerusalem was roughly 900 to 1,000 miles away, and the journey would have taken these visitors several months. The passage doesn't give us very much detail, and the scene is quite brief. And it's almost as if they just popped in for a cup of Persian tea. But in a world without phones and social media or modern news channels, there would have been very little way for anyone to hear of things going on much outside of their immediate vicinity. And news travelled slowly and often long after events had occurred. When Nehemiah asked about Jerusalem, he is devastated to learn that things are dire. The people are struggling, and the city walls, even after many, many years, still lie in ruins. And today, the idea of a city without walls might not seem like a big deal. But in Nehemiah's time, walls were vital for protection. They provided safety and security against attack and looting. And the walls symbolise the strength and stability of the people that live there. For Jerusalem to remain in ruins would have signalled not only physical vulnerability, but a real sense of disgrace. The broken walls would have been seen to outsiders as a reflection of God's continuing disapproval. Without God's favour, they weren't prospering. They were far from being a city on a hill or a light to the nations. And as Nehemiah later describes, they were in a state of disgrace. Being born in captivity, Nehemiah probably had never been to Jerusalem, but these were his people. They were his heritage, and he identified deeply with them and felt a strong connection to their suffering. And there's something really special about your own culture and heritage, isn't it? And I don't know whether as Brits I don't know whether we grasp that as much as other nations, but when we were in Greece, we saw firsthand among the Afghan and Iranian refugees that despite living in a foreign land, they really held tightly to their culture and their heritage. The deep connection to their culture remained strong, particularly for many of them who would never have been able to return. So unlike the Jewish people, some of these refugees wouldn't be able to go back. But likewise, Nehemiah had an unbreakable heart connection to his people, and they were God's chosen people. And he felt for their struggles, even from afar. Well, Nehemiah worked for the king, but not as a typical servant. He held a highly privileged position as cupbearer. I feel a bit like the cupbearer now. This role would have been far more than serving wine like a waiter. It was a position of immense trust and responsibility. And Nehemiah would taste the king's food and drink to ensure it wasn't poisoned, which was a necessary precaution for kings at that time who had lots of enemies. But Nehemiah was a trusted and key aide and confidant to the king. One of the closest people in the king's inner circle. And he would have also been responsible for administration and organisation. And he would have enjoyed all the privileges and perks that life in the palace afforded. And I was thinking, refreshments and admin. Sounds a bit like my job, doesn't it? We are not told how Nehemiah came to hold this position, but it's thought that Queen Esther's influence in the previous years would have contributed to the favour that had been shown to the Jewish people. And King Artaxerxes is believed to have been Esther's stepson. So cupbearers were also selected for their intelligence and looks. The king would want to be surrounded by people who were both visually appealing and clever. They were expected to remain cheerful at all times so as not to cause offence to the king. So why did this news of Jerusalem suddenly pierce Nehemiah's heart so? It was something that had been going on for a long, long time. So maybe it was the stark contrast between his own life of luxury and the suffering of the people. Maybe a sense of guilt overwhelmed him, knowing that he was living in comfort while they struggled. And every day we hear the news, don't we? We hear about wars and disasters and suffering, but it's very easy to feel detached. But everything changes when we hear a first-hand account. When someone shares their pain face to face, it becomes real, and it's not so easy to ignore. And many of us will have heard stories from Margaret or Anthea about poverty and hunger. We've met the people who are with the people that suffer. And we've listened to our Ukrainian brothers and sisters that we had in this church for a while. And they shared about their heartbreak of war and separation. And the women that we walk alongside in Thrive, they tell us of their experiences of homelessness and abuse and addiction. And we see their brokenness face to face. And through prison ministry, Bob and Ruth witness the impact of crime on families. And these personal stories remind us that behind every statistic is a real person facing a daily struggle. And they're not just in distant places, but right here in Kingsbridge, right here in this room. There are lives in need of restoration. And so Nehemiah was so overwhelmed by the news that he had to sit down. And I wonder, some of us will have experienced moments like this when unexpected news shatters our world and knocks us off our feet, leaving us heartbroken or grieving and unsure of what to do next. And I think none of us will go through life without having one of those moments. But God had placed a burden on Nehemiah's heart, and it filled him with a deep sense of compassion. But not just compassion, responsibility. The verse says he sat down and wept. So God's purposes collided with Nehemiah's heart, igniting something extraordinary within him. But instead of weighing him down, this burden would soon become a powerful catalyst for action. It wasn't a fleeting moment, a quick reaction that soon faded. Nehemiah was so deeply moved by the situation that his immediate response was to begin to pray and fast. And in his anguish, Nehemiah didn't turn to the mighty king of Persia, but to the all-powerful King of heaven. He brought his pain and this seemingly impossible situation before God. And his prayer reveals his deep understanding of who God is. He acknowledges God's greatness by saying, "Lord, the God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps his covenant of love." And this again reminds us, doesn't it, how our view of God shapes how we respond to challenges and what we believe is possible with God. Nehemiah doesn't offer a quick passing prayer, neither does he give God a list of what he thinks should be done. He prays day and night persistently, seeking God's attention, confessing not only his own sin, but the sins of Israel. And he openly acknowledges the wrongs that have been done and expresses his deep desire for God to be honoured once again. And while we don't know much about Nehemiah's personal life, it's clear from this prayer that despite being in captivity, he knows God, he knows the scriptures well. He's familiar with the laws given to Moses and the history of his people. Nehemiah wasn't to blame for Israel's past disobedience and sin. He wasn't even born when it all began, but he still took personal responsibility. And he continues to pray and seek God about the situation, not just for a few days or weeks, but for months. And by the spring, Nehemiah has a God-given plan, and he's ready to take action and approach the king. And in his prayer, which is the first of many that we'll see through the book of Nehemiah, he asks God for favour with the king, acknowledging that the king is, after all, just a man. And in those days, kings were held up as gods. I mean, they thought they were gods, and the people thought that they were gods. He doesn't ask God to bless his own plans and fix things. He asks God to intervene and to use him. Nehemiah reminds God of his promises, not that God needs reminding. But by doing this, God is saying, I trust you, God. I know you. I know who you are. I know you keep your promises. I know you're in the business of restoration. Use me. And I wonder, how often do we face a problem or have a big need or a situation where we need an answer? We may have ideas, really good ones, but it's God's solutions, it's God's clarity, it's God's plans that are going to take us from A to B. James 1:5 says, if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives generously to all. And wisdom isn't about having all the answers. It's about knowing where to find them. And like Nehemiah, if we trust God, he will guide us. We've heard today from Hannah, haven't we? Amazing. He's not a distant promise. He's a present help. But we have to take the first step, don't we, and seek him. So, what happens next? Chapter 2 goes on to tell us that in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes' reign, when wine was brought for him, I took the wine and I gave it to the king. I'd not been sad in his presence before. So the king asked me, why does your face look so sad when you are not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of heart. And Nehemiah says, I was very much afraid. But I said to the king, may the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire? So today is the day. Nehemiah's been carrying this burden for months, and his emotions are written all over his face. And the king notices straight away, and he asks Nehemiah, what's wrong? The king can tell it's something deep. And fear grips Nehemiah. I mean, things could go horribly wrong if you show sadness in front of the king. It's unheard of. But Nehemiah opens up and pours out his heart. And amazingly, the king responds, what is it you want? And in that moment, Nehemiah must have recalled all the many prayers he'd said and everything that God had revealed to him. He says, and then I prayed to the God of heaven. And I'm sure many of us have had that moment where we've maybe felt God nudging us or prompting us to act or speak out. But in that moment of fear or uncertainty, we say a quick arrow prayer, don't we, in our head, just to double check. God, is that really what you want? Give me the right words. Or simply, help. Nehemiah begins by reminding the king of his loyal service as a cupbearer and asks him to consider all that he's done. And then he boldly makes a request. Send me to Judah to rebuild the city of my ancestors. And you can imagine the room falling silent and the tension being quite thick in the air. And Nehemiah thinking, okay, well, this could be it. My career, and maybe even my life, could be over. And amazingly, the king doesn't say, really? You want to rebuild a city that's been in ruins for 150 years? The same city that I ordered to stop being rebuilt 13 years ago. I mean, how's that going to look if I reverse my own decree? I'm going to look ridiculous. Not to mention, he'd have to replace Nehemiah. Instead, the king simply asks, how long will you be gone? And when will you return? And we don't know what Nehemiah actually said there. But if you skip ahead to chapter 13, you find out that he didn't actually return for 12 years. And that's a lot of extended leave, isn't it? Even with all the bank holidays and time off in lieu. I think it was more of a sabbatical. But whatever he asked for, the king agreed. And Nehemiah must have thought, in for a penny, in for a pound. He'd asked for favour with the king, and now he was stepping out in faith. And sometimes we can be hesitant to ask for what we need. And it's surprising how willing people are to help, especially when they understand the need or catch a vision for something. But in Nehemiah's case, God had already gone before. But this is a reminder that when we pray in faith and in accordance with God's plans and purposes, answers will come from the most unexpected sources and ways. So Nehemiah goes on to reel out his list. Letters of safe passage through neighbouring territory. Oh, and he needed timber, lots of timber. So if he could have that from the king's forest, thank you. And he needed to make some beams for the temple gates and the walls. Oh, and the house, because he would need a house. He needed somewhere to live. And all of these requests, amazingly, were granted by the king. Because as Nehemiah says, the gracious hand of God was upon me. And not only did the king give him those things that he asked for, but he also sent an army of officers and horsemen to protect him on the way. And it's an incredible start to this story that we will continue over the next few weeks. I'm sure you're on the edge of your seats. And we're going to delve more into Nehemiah's story. But what can we take from all of this? Well, Nehemiah saw a need and felt the burden that God had placed on his heart. And using his position in the palace and favour he had with the king, and Nehemiah's willingness to be used by God, it brought about, or you will go on to hear, it brings about transformation and restoration of the people of Israel. It wasn't without challenges, and there was fear and uncertainty and opposition and pain. But through Nehemiah's dedication in prayer and his close relationship with God, Nehemiah was equipped with everything he needed to fulfill this calling. And you might be sitting here thinking, that's good. I can see needs all around. There's so many, aren't there? Where do we start? Broken lives, broken systems. I can see plenty that needs sorting and fixing and rebuilding and restoring in this world. But what difference can I make? What on earth do I have to offer? The task is too big. I have no expertise, no special skills, no experience, no resources. I don't know the first thing about whatever it is. Well, Nehemiah wasn't an engineer. He wasn't a contractor or an experienced construction manager. And he was quite probably the least practical or manual person God could choose to oversee such a project, other than Giles, who isn't very DIY. And, let's face it, Nehemiah had lived a pampered and cushy life in the palace. So actually not dissimilar to Giles at all. But at the time, many must have looked at Nehemiah and thought, who does he think he is launching this project? It's all been tried before. It's never going to happen. And you can hear the scoffers, can't you? And sadly, we do the same. We easily write someone off as unqualified for the task because they don't fit our stereotype. Or maybe we actually write ourselves off. There would have been thousands of people living in Jerusalem, and they would have literally been stepping over the rubble and the ruins as they visited the temple and went about their daily life. The devastation would have been visible all around. And I'm sure there were many thoughts and opinions on what should be done or could be done about the city wall. But perhaps, having become resigned to it after all these years, that was just the way it was. The task was just too big to tackle, and so the city wall and the people's lives remained in ruins. That is, until God placed a burden on Nehemiah. And it was painful, but God got Nehemiah's attention, and he took his pain about the situation to God in prayer. And C.S. Lewis, good old C.S. Lewis, says, God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pain. It's his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. And I wonder, how has God been shouting through your pain? To others, outwardly, we may not seem to have the credentials or resources to get a job done. But when we partner with God, when we're filled with his Spirit, when we follow his plan, we become more than qualified to achieve the most unbelievable things. And sometimes all we have in the beginning is a stirring in our hearts, just something that moves us, just a little spark. But when we bring it to God and we ask him to use us, there is no limit to what he can do. Jesus tells us with just a small seed of faith, as small as a mustard seed, we can move mountains or build walls or transform and restore lives. When God started to stir my heart for the homeless, and we embarked on this journey to set up a supported house, I never realised what a long and winding road it would be in the preparation. Oh my goodness. A lot of tears, prayer, frustration and discouragement, more setbacks, more tears, laying down my plans, or should I say, throwing them out the window and leaving them with God. And I couldn't make it happen. And if he wanted it to happen, well, he jolly well needed to get on with it, because I'd done everything that I could and exhausted myself. And as you can see, my prayers aren't quite so full of grace and humility as probably yours are, Mike. But looking back now, I see his favour and preparation in so many ways, right from way, way back when I left school and I fell straight into a great job, all down to me, so I thought, but it wasn't actually my first career choice. But I ended up working for a criminal litigation solicitors. And I had an amazing job for somebody who was so young. And I attended courts and prisons and trials. And we were on the defence team. So I would be talking to murderers and rapists one day and gold bullion thieves the next, and barristers and high court judges. And the range of people that I dealt with and the stories that I heard and the depths of despair and heartbreak actually in those stories. But I think God was preparing me, and to say nothing really shocks me could seem a bad thing, but it just got me really used to talking to people about really deep and crazy things without showing emotion and making judgments. But my eyes were open to the complex nature of people, should we say. And I really feel God's used that years later. And then again, years later, I took a little part-time job for a local insurance brokers, and it had just started up. And I was in at the beginning, and I was one of the first employees. And to cut a very long story short, and I think it's, was all about God's positioning really for the future. But I was given a few shares, and I didn't even know what shares were then, really. I just thought they were a nice little bit of paper. Maybe like Green Shield stamps or something. If you can remember Green Shield stamps. But years later, the company was sold to a really big concern. And I received a sum of money, which meant that actually we could pay off a chunk of our mortgage. Whilst I was in that job, I also met a lady who was really pivotal in my faith journey as well. And she was really, really inspiring. And so with all of that, we were able to pay some of our mortgage off. And it was very timely, as God had started to call me out of my full-time role as a manager. And he'd started to give me this vision for a community hub. But this wasn't without opposition, because when the new company took over, they wanted me to stay, and my new boss kept giving me his 5-year plans for making lots of money, which was tempting. Anyway, that led to an in-depth faith conversation with my boss, and I ended up leaving the company, handed in my notice, but I didn't actually have another job to go to. But I ended up working for our church at the time, and the community hub began to develop. And I've got lots of stories like that, and I'm sure you have. But through that time, we received such provision and such generosity, and it really taught us so much about how God uses other people to answer our prayers, and what we ought to be doing with our resources from God. But I think, we've heard Hannah's stories this morning, and we've all got stories. And we need to be sharing those stories because, like when Nehemiah was praying, he was reminding himself of who God was. When he was in pain, when he had a burden, he went back to God and he reminded himself of what God had done for him. And we need to share our stories. We need to encourage one another and build each other's faith, because the God we serve is limitless in his favour and resources. And we so often forget that, don't we? We slip into autopilot, relying on our own strength and leaving God out of the equation until we've exhausted every other option. And sometimes we don't receive because we don't ask. Our expectations of God are far too small. How can he show us his power and provide beyond our wildest dreams more than we can ask or imagine when we think we have all the answers or we leave him out of the plans? Do we have the faith to believe that God wants to build his church here in Kingsbridge? And he has much more for us, doesn't he? I mean, this is lovely, isn't it? But are we content with this? Are we content with who we are as Kingsbridge Family Church? Is it enough for you? It might be. But I wonder, what are you believing for? What hopes and dreams have you got within you? Are we going to trust God enough to offer the little that we have in order that he can multiply it and do the rest? And I think a lot of us sitting here today might not actually realise what we have to offer, what we have to give, and I'm not talking about money. Do you know what God has placed in your hands? Do you? What you can offer him back for his glory. I wonder if God has been nudging you. Has he placed a burden on your heart? Have you thought about where he's placed you in your work, in your retirement, in your social circles, in the waiting room of your hospital appointment? Because it's no coincidence that you and I are here now in Kingsbridge. That's God's timing and it's his positioning. Have you heard God's call, but you're too scared to step out? Is there something you've put on the back burner and maybe you think you've missed the boat? Now, I'm conscious that we're all at different stages in our life here, aren't we? Look around. But we mustn't fall into the trap of believing that God can't use us because of our age or our lack of agility, or in my case, my ridiculous menopause brain that means I forget everyday words like cheese when I'm holding it in my hand. And God wants to use all our lifetime's experiences for his purpose. You may not have the physical strength to lift the stones and rebuild a city wall. But you do have the spiritual strength to support others through prayer. And Hannah said it earlier, didn't she? About, I think she'd been reading this. She said, that her church released her, and it was about prayer, wasn't it? And believing in her. God might want to give you a prayer burden to intercede for a particular situation, a group of people, a cause, something he wants to bring to pass, something he wants to share with you, to entrust to you, because you are the person for the job. Have you asked him? And perhaps your journey has been one of overcoming great challenges, a testimony of God's faithfulness, his provision, his restoration and transformation. Your story might be the very encouragement and inspiration or guidance someone else needs to find their own path forward. Who can you encourage and who can you mentor? No matter our age or experience or how long we've walked with God, everything starts with a willing heart. So are you willing to offer yourself to him for whatever purpose he has for you in this season, regardless of where you are and what's going on? Because God is searching for willing vessels, ready to be filled with his Spirit. And he looks at the heart. He doesn't look at our physical abilities or our great qualifications and all the wonderful jobs we've had throughout our life. He looks at our heart. And if you sense that God has placed a burden on your heart, it might be a little seed of something. Don't dismiss it, don't ignore it, and don't push it away. Pursue it. What are you going to do with it? Are you going to set it aside? Or like Nehemiah, will you move into action with that? Will you seek God's heart? Share it with someone. Or maybe you don't see how on earth God could use you, but deep down you want to be available and you want him to use you, but you just don't think he will. Share it with someone. Are you willing to let God stretch your compassion and open your eyes to the needs around you? Will you ask him, Lord, who have you called me to serve? Or will you dare to pray, Lord, show me what you want me to do? I mean, he might send you to Brazil, like Hannah. Will you step forward in faith and allow him to use you? You know, they're bold prayers, aren't they? And they come with a cost to our comfort and to our time and to our resources. And it comes with fear of what others think, fear of failure. What if I'm wrong? What if I look foolish? And all the other what ifs. But what if you surrender your own plans and let God fill your heart with his vision and purpose? What if you trust that he will equip you for whatever he calls you to do? And what if you step forward in faith, not knowing exactly where that might lead? Who knows what God can do with a heart that is fully surrendered to him? You know, we've got a lot of big decisions to make in the next few months about our building and about our commitment to employing a full-time pastor down the line. And each one of us needs to play our part in the decision-making and take the responsibility seriously, because it's not like when you're voting for a politician and you don't really know and you might go to the box and you just tick any box. The effects of our decisions will have consequences, not only for us now, us as Kingsbridge Family Church, but for our community and future generations. And we can stay safe and content plodding along, or we can step out of our comfort zones and we can seek God's heart and his passion and his burdens, and we can believe for something more. We can sit on the sidelines, or we can say, as in the sporting world, and I really like this phrase, we can have skin in the game. We can sit on the sidelines, or we can get in. Anyway, that's enough from me. I've just got one thing to read, and I came across this prayer, and you might know it, but it's the prayer of Sir Francis Drake, and that came as a surprise to me. The great adventurer who circumnavigated the world. And he asked God to disturb us from our small dreams and our timid faith. And this prayer is a wonderful challenge for all of us to dream big and live with eternity in mind and be willing to be used by God. So I'm going to just read it now. I am conscious of time, but he says, "Disturb us, Lord, when we are too well pleased with ourselves, when our dreams have come true because we've dreamed too little. when we arrived safely because we sailed too close to the shore. Sorry. I want you to read it. I want you to read it through. I want you to read it, but I don't want you to read it if you don't mean it. So what I would ask you to do is just read it through. And then maybe we'll read it together and we'll stand. So I'm just going to give you a minute to read it through, because I don't think you want to pray this prayer unless you mean it. Well, that's a bit of a difficulty then, isn't it? I'm going to read it. And if you agree with it, stand up, if you are able, at the end and say amen. Disturb us, Lord, when we are too well pleased with ourselves, when our dreams have come true because we have dreamed too little, when we arrive safely because we sailed too close to the shore. Disturb us, Lord, when the abundance of things we possess, with the abundance of things we possess, we have lost our thirst for the waters of life. Having fallen in love with life, we have ceased to dream of eternity, and in our efforts to build a new earth, we have allowed our vision of the new heaven to dim. Disturb us, Lord, to dare more boldly, to venture on wider seas, where storms will show your mastery, and where losing sight of land, we shall find the stars. We ask you to push back the horizons of our hopes and to push into the future in strength, courage, hope, and love. This we ask in the name of our captain, who is Jesus Christ.